Okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this video. I want to start off with saying something very clear. I am not an epidemiologist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not anyone. I'm a young person with a camera and an opinion. Though, I do want to state this. I am happy about how open source science has become over the pandemic. I think through its bad, it has increased access to scientific information and journals for people who normally do not have access to that. And that's overall a good thing, and I'm very proud that that's happened. Unfortunately, that has come with a caveat. Plenty of preprint studies have been taken advantage of tremendously. We've seen that with ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and lockdowns, public health measures, masks, preprints that come out with questionable ethics or study issues, and even if they weren't intentional, they can be grasped by anyone with a specific bias or perspective, taken and used for their own good. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. And to think that the public can grasp all of this information and come at it at an unbiased, objective, scientific view without placing their own biases onto that piece of paper is wishful thinking at best. And that's why I'm standing here and I have to talk about this paper from John Hopkins University, which made a bold claim and is being grasped heavily right now by the right wing, that lockdowns reduce mortality by 0.2%. And that's where we stand. And right now, a bunch of media outlets are taking that information and running wild with it. You've probably seen it everywhere, but not anyone's debunking it, which is unfortunate. So, let's talk about lockdowns, what their intended purpose is, the consequence of them, which we know is real, and so forth, okay? So I'm going to put a graph here. Here's your graph, and here's an x-axis, and here's a y-axis. On the x-axis, we're going to put, I had a black one, but there it is. On the x-axis, we're going to put time, traveling through time, forward, right? So here it can be March 2020, and this can be now, the present. Whatever I put on here is not going to, it's going to be loosely based on what I remember of actual statistics of watching the cases flow up and down. It won't be directly taken from any city or any source. So, except probably New York would be a big reference point. So, March 2020. On the y-axis, going up, we're going to look at cases, then we're going to look at hospitalizations, and then we're going to look at deaths. Three very important variables. Arguably these two more so. We're talking utilitarian-wise. So, in the middle of this graph, I'm not going to do anything with it yet. We're going to discuss a few concepts. One, the R-naught. What is the R-naught? That's a cool little term for the reproductive rate. What does that mean? Objectively, well, the reproductive rate simply is a number that estimates how many individuals one infected person is likely to spread a virus to. This is typically acknowledged to be on a spectrum. So down here you have things like influenza with an R-naught of around 1.2 to 1.5, right? And all the way up here you have things like chickenpox, somewhere around here probably, and measles, which I think I've heard that it changes a little bit. It's not always completely accurate. 15 to 20. And that actually, somewhere around here, may be Omicron, or COVID's current form. The original COVID strain. Lockdowns and the effectiveness of certain measures change depending on the actual infectiousness of a virus. Okay? So, going back to March of 2020, our original, what could be called the Wuhan strain, I don't like calling it that, but the wild type variant of COVID, or not a variant, the original strain, wild type COVID, had an R naught of around 2. And that was, at the time, manageable with lockdowns. Right? So, what is the purpose? How do we think objectively about restricting that number? So if your R naught is 2, what that means is that one person will spread to 2 others. Each of these individuals on their own will spread to 2 other individuals. And then 2 more from that, from each individual. And what you can see here is exponential growth if you do not hamper the transmission of that virus. We have 1, 2, 4, and 8, which can be mapped logarithmically or exponentially, which we're going to get to our graph. So, if a virus is transmitting rapidly throughout a population, slowly taking over that population, right? Slowly gaining more and more. This is your population. These are your infected. At one time, a proportion of that infected population within a short time frame, these right here, are going to require hospitalization. That is bad in terms of actually limiting the number of people in the hospital. So what happens? If a virus ramps up from 0 to its original patient 0, the original person who came in and contacted within a city, and that virus spreads exponentially, well, at the same time, hospitalizations will go up quite quickly, superseding or going over the threshold of beds required to actually keep these patients alive. Once you've hit a threshold, all patients that require hospitalization do not get the care that will actually help them survive their COVID-19 infection. And the point, originally, the 2 weeks to flatten the curve, was to flatten it, bring the R naught down. That's how you flatten it. So if you take your R naught and you take it from 2 and you bring it to 1, well, that means one person infects one person, infects one person, infects one person, and over time, the number of people infecting each other will stay flat. And it'll come back down once it's run out of susceptible individuals. That's something called your SIR. You're susceptible, you're infected, and you're recovered. Once you've run out of susceptibles by infecting all of them, and you have your remaining recovered or dead, then the cases of the virus will return back down, or not, will drop naturally because it runs out of people to infect. Okay, and the point in there, at that point originally, I'm going on a little long about this, was to keep hospitalizations lower. Keep it below that threshold. Buy time for treatments. Buy time for certain things that can treat. And there came 2 philosophies from this. How long do we impose these measures for? My philosophy was until vaccines. Because if you could keep the R naught below 1, if your virus spreads and you can keep it below 1, especially starting off, and you can cause a virus to actually die out and stay at a low, very low rate, you can, before you release these lockdown restrictions, you can have people vaccinated before it spikes again. And that will keep deaths low anyway. The other was, well, we've bought time for treatments, we need to live our lives, live it normally, and continue on, and so forth. But those are the things that we need to understand when it comes to understanding this study. Now, there were multiple methods. The question is, how do we define a lockdown? Public health measures, there were plenty that attempted to reduce the overall infections of COVID-19. Some of those were masks. Some of those were closing bars. Some of those were closing restaurants. Some of those were closing malls. Some of those were restricting gatherings. Some of them were all of these. So how do we define lockdown? Well, this study does it, I think, in an unfortunate way. I don't think this study accurately addresses... Oh, well, you know what? Let's keep that here. Gatherings. This study said that a lockdown, how they defined it, was a lockdown was the utilization of one or more non-pharmaceutical interventions. Read that again. The utilization, this is from John Hopkins, this study. The utilization of one or more non-pharmaceutical interventions. So what's a lockdown? This is a non-pharmaceutical intervention. Is that a lockdown? It's being very vague, right? Would not call that a lockdown. Now, if you just close bars after 10 p.m., this is what Knoxville did. Didn't really do anything else. Is that a lockdown? Now, if you do these both, is that a lockdown? Some areas only did these two things. What if you closed bars, masks, and restaurants? Is that a lockdown? Okay, alright. Now, what if you closed malls, closed restaurants, closed bars, and required masks? Is that a lockdown? But you let people gather wherever they wanted? Now, okay. Now, what if you required masks, closed bars, closed restaurants, closed malls, and restricted gatherings to less than 10? Is that a lockdown? Is that a lockdown? Okay, all right. A little further. What if you required masks, closed bars, closed restaurants, closed malls, restricted gatherings to none whatsoever? You couldn't leave your house unless the military provided you food from the military. That might be a lockdown. That's a more accurate assessment of what a lockdown is. Now, the reason I'm putting this to you is because the United States did many things differently. If you lived in Texas, if you lived in Florida, you may have lived in an area with a mask requirement. And according to this study of one or more non-pharmaceutical interventions, that was a lockdown. Now, this is not to say that the paper went in and defined that as a lockdown and used that as a study. So I'll go even further. If you lived in Florida, if you lived in Tennessee, and your city required masks and closed bars after 10 p.m., that study defines this as a lockdown. Now, if you lived in New York City during the beginning of this, where masks weren't required, but obviously that was done. Restricted gatherings, right? Don't leave house. People weren't going anywhere. That might be closer to a lockdown. If you live in China, and you can't leave the house whatsoever. While cases above threshold, that might be more of a lockdown, right? That might be more of a lockdown. So we can see that there is a spectrum. There is a massive spectrum of what defines a lockdown and how much the R0 is going to be impacted, thus how much hospitalizations are going to be impacted, therefore how much deaths are going to be impacted. So if you lived in the state of Florida, simple interventions might have brought the R0 from 2 to about 1.8. If you lived in Tennessee, those interventions might have brought it from 2 to about 1.6 in your city or wherever you are. Tennessee. If you lived in New York, those interventions might have brought it to 2 to about 1.1 or 1.2. If you lived in China, those interventions might have brought it from 2 to less than 1. And your curve fell. And your curve ultimately flattened, then fell. And then your curve ultimately didn't do much, and then flattened, and then hospitalizations went with it, and then your curve just straight up just did what the hell it was going to do. Okay? Does that make sense? There is a spectrum of interventions that take place here. And to put these on a meta-analysis and to compare these as if they were equal is unfair. Specifically if you're looking at the United States. Now what if you're looking at a country like Australia, which never saw too much exponential growth? And their cases did spike, then they brought it back down to strict, very strict lockdown measures, and then never allowed them to return. What if New Zealand, which had very strict lockdowns, and then never saw their cases go up? Do their deaths reduce? When you use that along a flat plane, then cases going up and then staying at 0, you're not going to see too much of a significant decrease in deaths because they never had them. Right? These are the flaws that you have to look for in a study. These are the things that you really need to analyze. These are the things that we have to question when you look at a non-peer-reviewed study. Specifically, when it's one done by economists about epidemiology. There might be some flaws about the R0, about transmission, about many aspects of certain things of disease and infectious disease and all of these things that just aren't addressed by economists because they're not experts in that field. In fact, they may have some biases. Scientists are not just unbiased creatures. These are the things you have to think about and look at and actually address and don't ignore. Because simply by looking at this study, you can see a flaw in the definition of what a lockdown is. I know it comes from a trusted source, but that doesn't mean the methodology is always the greatest. The utilization of one or more non-pharmaceutical interventions cannot be defined as a lockdown. Now that's not all it had. They had more direct examples, more things that are closer to UK's lockdown. I think they called them SI or C something, SI something. I don't remember. But this is just one point I wanted to target. One point right here that you can't ignore when you're taking a whole study and quoting it, and especially using it for political points that have major implication if we ever have another pandemic in the future. Because this kind of stuff translates scientifically to other issues. And when you start decreasing the trust in science overall, it's not just going to impact COVID-19, It's going to impact other public health policies, such as measles vaccination, right? It's going to affect climate change policies, right? It's going to affect, what else is big and predominantly an issue in science? I mean, we've had evolution and so forth, but this doesn't really have as much of an impact on our lives and so forth. But these issues are real. These issues are unfortunate, and you have to question stuff, and you have to try to approach things from an unbiased perspective. If anyone tells you that staying at home away from other individuals does not decrease your likelihood of catching or spreading a disease, then that study probably has significant flaws. That's it. Sign off. Thank you.